all for being here. I'm just delighted to be with you. And I also would like to I'm delighted to be here in connection with the Abu Dhabi, NYU Abu Dhabi Educational Project, and I'd like to thank Vice Chancellor Hilary Bannon very much for inviting me. So my talk my brief for this talk was to speak personally on the theme of education, taking as my starting point my own memories of my educational journey in Egypt and England, and touching on my years in the United Arab Emirates. Education hasn't been my own field of study, but like many here, besides being its beneficiary, I've been a lifelong practitioner in the work of passing on the tools and skills of critical thinking that are at the heart of the educational enterprise. So it's a subject I can certainly speak about personally. But even just speaking personally, it's still a vast subject, which one could address in any number of ways. As I turned over in my mind what particular angles to take up today, I found myself repeatedly returning in my thoughts to two. Now, how do I get this off? What? B, because I don't want this to distract you till I get to these things. So, as I turned over in my mind what particular angles to take up, I found myself returning to two poets in particular whose works I've enjoyed over the years, and because I think their works raise questions that are particularly pertinent in our times. So the last decade has been by far the most dramatically eventful decade in my own life with respect to the two regions that I call home, Egypt and America, more broadly, the Middle East and the West. Even as globalizing forces draw us closer, we've all also been living through a resurgence of ancient veins of hostility and mutually destructive and distorting misperceptions. And so issues of the multicultural dimension of education and the interplay between local and global cultures seem to be particularly salient issues to think about today in connection with education. While the events of our times emphatically foreground the importance of multicultural issues, these are issues that have in fact been with us for a long time in relation to education. They were certainly present for example, when I was a child growing up in Cairo, Egypt, attending a British school. Back then, though, such topics were not generally out on the table in the way they are today. This was also the case when I was in the Emirates. The kind of questions that arise for us today with regard to multiculturalism were certainly there implicitly in the structure and dynamics of the educational situation in the Emirates, for instance, as they were also in Cairo. But again, in my recollection, they were not topics we addressed directly, and certainly not with the kind of complexity and self-awareness that we bring to them today. Can you hear me okay, Mary? The two poets who came to mind for me as pertinent to this topic were George Herbert and Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. And for the remainder of my talk, I'll reflect on aspects of their work against the backdrop of my own educational journey to the theme of multiculturalism. In relation to the theme, Michael, could I ask you to do something, plug this in to show something? So I'm going to well, maybe I can just show you the poems as they are. B, you said? Okay. So the two poets, as I said, or did I say? George Herbert, and his first poem is called Prayer. He has many poems, most of them very strictly about Christianity. This was one of the few famous ones that's not only, I mean, it is only about Christianity, but also more widely, called Prayer. Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth, the soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth, engine against the almighty, sinner's tower, reverse sunder, Christ's side-piercing spear, the 6 days' world transporting in an hour, a kind of tune which all things hear and fear, softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manna, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well-dressed, the Milky Way, the birds of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. Now the next one is from Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, from a poem called Turjuman al-Ashwaq. My heart can take on any form, a meadow for gazelles, a cloister for monks, for the idol's sacred ground, Kaaba for the circling pilgrim, the tables of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran. I profess the religion of love. Wherever its caravan turns along the way, that is the belief, the faith I keep. So it's easy to see, I think, that there's some sort of underlying affinity between these two poets, and certainly it's always seemed to me entirely natural that I liked both. And yet, to my surprise now, as I began to think about them in the context of multiculturalism, I found myself noticing not their similarities, but on the contrary, their suddenly now striking differences. Most particularly, Ibn Arabi mentions in his poem the Torah and the Quran, that is, both Jewish and Muslim sacred texts, and he mentions the Islamic Kaaba and the Christian monastery, as well as spaces sacred to the worship of idols, referring to them all, apparently, as equally valid spaces and scriptures for worshippers of the one true religion, a religion he calls the religion of love. George Herbert, in contrast, in my recollection of his poetry, never mentions any religion other than Christianity. It was this difference now which captured my attention and which I explore in the rest of this talk. I first encountered George Herbert's poetry at the age of about 10 or 11, when I was attending the English school in Heliopolis, a suburb of Cairo. I'd attended another school for my first school year, the English Mission School. However, that school soon issued a statement declaring that it could not desist, as some parents had requested, from its practice of seeking to convert children to Christianity, since this was a key part of its mission. So at the end of the school year, my parents withdrew my older sister and myself from this girls' school, and placed us in an English school, which was a mixed-gender school, which my brothers were already attending. In contrast to the mission school, the English school's policy was, it said, to respect the religious beliefs of their non-Christian students. In practice, this meant that Jewish and Muslim students were exempt from morning prayers, which were required for Christians. Thus, at the end of the morning assembly, the headmaster would conclude his announcement with the words, "Jews and Muslims fall out." This was the era when there were quite significant numbers of Jews in Egypt. At which point, as Christians trooped off into hall for prayers, we Jews and Muslims were free for 15 minutes or so to roam the playgrounds. This was how the school day began always, except on Mondays, when we too marched into hall and in fact joined in school prayers. Although these were Christian prayers, they had been carefully edited, the school said, to be acceptable to Muslims and Jews. They were, as the school saw it, simply generically monotheistic prayers. So on Monday mornings, we joined in rituals which included, among them, reciting the Lord's Prayer, a prayer which, of course, makes no reference to Jesus, and also in singing hymns which similarly were chosen because they mentioned God, but not Jesus. It was on one such morning that I first encountered what I would later learn was a poem by George Herbert called The Elixir, but which I first knew as the hymn called "Teach Me, My God and King." I recall singing it enthusiastically, and I recall that I enjoyed returning to its words in my mind, particularly the verse about seeing through the glass to the heavens beyond, if some of you must know this hymn, and also the one about a servant sweeping the floor, "as for thy sake." Words which I think somehow allayed some inarticulate anxiety I had as to the unsettling mystery of why some people were servants while others were not. This was all I knew of George Herbert until, aged 18, I left Egypt to attend college in England. Here at Cambridge, I read English for my first degree, and here, consequently, I'd soon discover and come to love Herbert's works, along with those of many other wonderful English writers. I look back to that era as almost a magical time. Of course, everything here was new to me, and yet also, in some ways, deeply familiar. This was, after all, the world I'd spent my childhood and adolescence immersed in through books and movies. And now here it all was daffodils, the English weather, the college woods, and of course the entirely new social freedoms that were suddenly available to me. Astonishingly, despite all this novelty, the experience of reading also continued to be deeply enthralling as I now plunge into intensively reading novels and poetry, Hardy, Milton, Spencer, Blake, the Romantics. It was through the Cambridge system of college supervisions rather than university lectures that the most valuable learning took place for me. Here, just 2 or 3 of us students would meet weekly with our supervisor to read over essays and discuss and analyze texts. Truth be told, I often found myself quite at sea trying to follow out what seemed to be very abstruse arguments. Still, I seem to have managed eventually to absorb something of the critical skills and tools I was exposed through such sessions, and years later I even began to figure out how to draw on these in my own work. What I received at Cambridge in those years was, of course, a classic example of the British liberal arts education of that era. Although absorbed in lapping it all up, I had little consciousness of this at the time. Similarly, I was no doubt unaware that I in fact embodied in my own life the complexities of being bicultural and the conditions of double consciousness that's inherently part of life for those of us located in those places of intersection that are also, of course, places, to be sure, of interconnection and of opening up onto new and different worlds. While at some level such issues probably did preoccupy me, I don't think I self-consciously thought about them any more than I'd given any thought as a child as to why it was that, growing up in Egypt, I was learning more about England and Egypt and occasionally even singing hymns. It was probably when I was in the Emirates that I began to think about such issues, working as I did now in an educational system which drew on contemporary Arab and mainly Egyptian and Iraqi models of education, as well as on Western models, all of which, Egyptian, Iraqi, and Western, were foreign to the local population. Thinking about the sorts of questions this system raised in relation to my Emirate students surely led me to begin to ponder also my own complicated educational history. Altogether, my experience in the Emirates would open up for me, in ways that I describe in my memoir, whole new areas of interest and new intellectual horizons. These would lead me soon to leave the field in which and I describe these in memoirs, so I won't talk about them here. This would lead me soon to leave the field of my undergraduate and graduate work, English and Oriental Studies, in order to work now in the then emergent field of women's studies. This move from one liberal arts field or another into women's studies was one that many women of my generation made, bringing with us the skills of our liberal arts training. Changing my scholarly field didn't mean I now abandoned my interest in literature. On the contrary, in addition to English, I came now more and more to enjoy other world literatures, including, naturally, those of the Islamic world, among them the works of the poets such as Jalaluddin Rumi and Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. So thinking now about Herbert and Ibn Arabi in the context of reflecting on multiculturalism in education, I was struck, as I mentioned, by the fact that one of them wrote inclusively about other religions, while the other apparently didn't even mention any other religion. So I set out now to discover what the facts were in the case. Had Herbert written about other religions, and if so, what had he written? Also, how had it happened that, writing in the 13th century of the Common Era, a period we think of as the Dark Ages, Ibn Arabi nevertheless had somehow managed to come up with his seemingly extraordinarily pluralist vision of the world's different religions, whether monotheistic or non-monotheistic? Such were the questions I set out to answer, and here briefly are some of the answers I found. Ibn Arabi was born in Murcia, in Muslim Spain, in 1165 of the Common Era. This was a time when the Muslim powers in Spain were steadily losing ground. It was a time also of widespread war, not only between Muslim and Christian local rulers, but also between one Christian ruler and another, and between Muslim rulers and other Muslims. Sometimes a Christian ruler made an alliance with a Muslim against a fellow Christian. Similarly, a Muslim ruler might join forces with a Christian to defeat a rival Muslim. Through these shifting wars and frontiers, the citizenry, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish, could find themselves forced to flee persecution. And for Muslims, this might occur not only when Christian conquered what had been Muslim territory, but also if that territory was conquered by rival Muslims belonging to a different faction of Islam. So the dividing lines in these wars occurred not only between people of different religions, but also between people ostensibly of the same religion. Such was the case in relation to Ibn Arabi. His father was a general in the army of one Muslim ruler, and when he was defeated, the new Muslim ruler took him on as a general in his own army. Things went well for a time. The family moved to Seville, where Ibn Arabi grew up, fully intending to pursue his father's military profession. When he was in his early teens, however, he had a vision in which Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad all appeared to him, instructing him to renounce material things and devote himself to the path of the inner life. Ibn Arabi obeyed, renouncing his inheritance and embracing a life of poverty. He apprenticed himself to Sufis, that is, to Muslim mystics who were following the path of poverty. He developed a reputation for spiritual powers, even as a teenager, attracting the attention, among others, of Ibn Rushd, the Aristotelian philosopher and rationalist known in the West as Averroes. Averroes also lived in Seville, and biographies of Ibn Arabi describe a legendary meeting that now took place between the older philosopher and the teenage mystic. Ibn Arabi's career as a prolific writer, philosopher, and mystic began in these years. Meanwhile, ongoing wars and growing Muslim losses to the Christian Reconquista made life in Spain ever more insecure, and in the year 1200, Ibn Arabi left Spain. He traveled to Morocco, then to Mecca, then to Anatolia, settling eventually in Damascus, where he spent his last years as a widely revered philosopher. He died in 1240. Buried in Damascus, his tomb has been a site of pilgrimage for centuries. Among those who admired him was Abraham Maimonides, son of the great Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides. Maimonides, the father, like Ibn Arabi, was a native of Spain during the era of turbulent wars, and he too left Spain, eventually settling in Egypt, where he became head of the Jewish community and physician to the king. His son Abraham, who succeeded him as head of the Jewish community, was strongly drawn to Sufism and specifically to the work of Ibn Arabi. Establishing a Jewish Sufi movement, he had one of Ibn Arabi's books transcribed into Hebrew letters. Though revered by many, Ibn Arabi was also from early on reviled and persecuted by some Muslims, who saw him as a dangerous heretic, a strand of thinking, by the way, that persists among some Muslims to this day. Such, then, were some of the elements of play shaping the history which formed the backdrop to Ibn Arabi's well-known verse, a verse that even today continues to be very often quoted and appreciated as expressive of an inclusivist, multi-religious vision at its best. Meanwhile, as I was reading into this history, I was also exploring the question of how George Herbert had dealt with other religions. Born in Wales in 1593, Herbert was from a wealthy English family. He attended Westminster School and then Cambridge University, intending to become a priest. When Cambridge offered him a position, however, he accepted. Soon, though, at the invitation of the king, King James I, he went on to serve in Parliament. The king's death, however, put an end to Herbert's ambitions for further advancement, and he now decided to return to his original vocation. In 1630, he was ordained priest and took up the position of rector in a parish church near Salisbury, where he was much appreciated by his parishioners. He devoted his spare time to writing poetry and died of tuberculosis in 1633, aged only 40. He left his poems to friends who arranged for their publication. As I mentioned earlier, so far as I recalled in my undergraduate days, Herbert hadn't written anything about any religion other than Christianity. Now, though, I discovered that he'd written one poem referencing another religion, a poem called The Jews. The poem expressed the hope the Jews will eventually convert to Christianity. The expression of such a hope, as a scholar of English poetry of that era, Nabil Matta, points out, was commonplace at the time in England, and in particular among those who were supporters of the king. This was a period when, quote, officially there were no Jews in England, unquote. Theological debates about the Jews, though, now became politically important in the fierce internal struggles that were underway at the time between supporters of the king on the one hand and Cromwell and his supporters on the other. In 1649, Cromwell briefly assumed power, inaugurating his reign by signing the death warrant for the execution of the king. Matter notes that in expressing a pious hope for the conversion of the Jews, Herbert was essentially simply espousing arguments that implicitly supported the rule of the king. On the other side were the anti-monarchists who favored Cromwell and whose position on this matter was that the Jews could not be converted until after their exile had ended. Herbert's position in his poem, in short, was not really about Jews at all, but rather essentially a symbolic espousal of the royalist cause. By this point in my researches, I was beginning to tentatively formulate various speculations as to the reasons that might explain the differences between the two poets as regards other religions. Firstly, obviously, Ibn Arabi grew up and throughout his life lived in multi-religious societies which consisted above all of Christians and Jews as well as Muslims, a multi-religiousness that Herbert clearly had no experience of. Secondly, over the course of his life, Ibn Arabi had to flee not only from Christian Reconquista in Spain, but also from persecution from his fellow Muslims, who considered him a heretic. Both of these social realities, making up the ground of Ibn Arabi's own experiences, could well in themselves, it seemed to me, have created conditions which could have fostered reflections on religious belief in ways which would have made envisaging religious pluralism, as he does in this poem, an imaginative possibility. A further factor also perhaps enabling Ibn Arabi to make this kind of a leap, imaginative leap, might have been that while he, like Herbert, had been born into an elite family, unlike Herbert, Ibn Arabi had had to flee his home country and had found himself for a good part of his life shorn of the elite networks of power and privilege, that he'd been born to. Consequently, for significant periods of his life, as a result both of his vow of poverty and his exile, he'd have been an observer of society from the margins rather than the center, and possibly, therefore, he was able to develop a more critical view of the reigning dogmas and certainties of his society. Even as I was mentally sketching out such preliminary conclusions, I continued delving into the history of Ibn Arabi's writings. And now I came across other studies which seemed to undercut, or at any rate to complicate, my earlier preliminary conclusions. In one of these studies, an essay by Carl Heller published in 1999, the author argues that while Ibn Arabi's poems seem to imply a pluralist view of other religions, there was evidence, and in particular a letter he wrote to a prince of Konya, that indicated that Ibn Arabi was not, in fact, as tolerant and as inclusive as his poem implies. In this letter, Ibn Arabi instructs the prince to apply strict Sharia restrictions to Christians residing in his kingdom, including not permitting them to ring their church bells. In another study, published in 2004, another scholar, Claude Adas, the author of a major biography on Ibn Arabi, argues that Ibn Arabi's letter to the prince does not, in fact, mean that he didn't recognize the validity of all creeds, as his poetry and other writings suggested. Rather, Adas argues, we need to bear in mind that the year in which Ibn Arabi wrote this letter was the very year in which the Christian Reconquista in Spain dealt a crushing blow to Muslims, and also that it was in this same year that the Crusaders gained important territories in the East. Ibn Arabi's letter, Adas argues, is the letter of someone living through the anguish of these crushing defeats. In any case, though, even if we accept Adas's argument that Ibn Arabi's letter does not negate the validity of the pluralist vision articulated in his poem, and I personally find that argument plausible, it does show that while Ibn Arabi was imaginatively capable of envisaging a religiously egalitarian and pluralist world, this was not a position that he was able to invariably abide by and maintain as he lived through the vicissitudes of the history of his times. There were evidently moments when he too, like George Herbert and like most of us, became entrapped in the convictions and prejudices of his own day. Noticeably, these studies of the theme of pluralism in Ibn Arabi, as also in the case of George Herbert's poem in relation to the Jews, were all published in the 1990s or the 2000s. That is, they're all noticeably recent studies. Both George Herbert and Ibn Arabi, of course, have been studied for many decades now and from many perspectives. But studies of their work in relation to pluralism and multiculturalism, matters of deep concern in our own era, are evidently just beginning to get underway. I have every expectation that we will soon have many more such studies, and therefore more light too soon on Ibn Arabi in particular, whose voluminous works have yet to be thoroughly studied. So to conclude now, where does all this leave us in relation to themes of education and multiculturalism? Well, firstly, obviously, the scholars conducting such researches on Ibn Arabi, George Herbert, and many more people, women and men, rich and poor, across the many societies, are scholars who are exercising precisely those critical skills that constitute the very heart of liberal education. Reflecting on all of these points together vividly brought home to me what an extraordinary gift and privilege it is to live in times when we can widely and freely explore the vast and varied range of histories and societies that make up our common human heritage. We do well, I think, to explore and reflect on all of these resources in their enormous wealth in our attempts to respond to the tremendous challenges of our time. Thank you.
First, also, I would like to thank the organizers of this event and NYU Abu Dhabi for inviting me to speak today with Professor Leila Ahmed, whose seminal work continues to influence my thinking to this day. It is a real honor to be on this panel with her. Okay, so I was, just like Professor Ahmed, I was asked to give a few comments on education, and unlike her, actually, who she has this wealth of, of course, insight into the history and the development of intellectual thought in the Middle East and Arab world. I'm looking into what's happening today in Egypt, the Egyptian revolt of January 25th, and I'm going to try to make some links between education and what's happening in Egypt today. Okay, so in the recent events of the Arab Spring, young Arabs have emerged as the region's revolutionaries in the face of tyranny and corruption. Analysts and observers of the Arab world today have linked rising levels of education to the increased dissatisfaction with local governments that misuse resources and offer no opportunities for employment or hope for the future. Women, in particular, have come forward as a power to contend with in the protests that took place in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. They have marched from all classes and religions, some bringing with them their children, others putting themselves in the line of fire, undaunted by military tanks and the violence of thuggery. In Egypt alone, on any given day during the events of January 25, 2011, women comprised 20 to 50% of the protesters. In my talk today, I would take a look at women's education in Egypt to explore the links between levels of education, poverty, and the Egyptian revolution. I will pay particular attention to the emerging efforts of women's Islamic organizations, which is the focus of my recent research and book, An Islam of Our Own, to spread education and vocational training in rural areas of the country. My aim is to examine the outcome of an Islamic education on Egypt's future political life. So as in many parts of the world, the Middle East and North Africa region is challenged by high levels of illiteracy. Yet by comparison to the rest of the world, the MENA has one of the highest rates of illiteracy, with rates highest in rural than in urban areas, and among females than males. So for example, in Egypt, in rural areas, there are 23% of males are illiterate to 45% of females. In urban areas in Egypt, 20% of males are illiterate to 22% of females. Although countries like Tunisia and Jordan have succeeded in closing the gender literacy gap within a period of approximately 30 years, which is quite astounding, and then their populations, of course, are much smaller than the population of Egypt, which is 82 million. Challenges to overcome the causes behind high levels of illiteracy remain daunting. Poverty, lack of development, and unemployment are, to say the least, a few of the more pressing issues among countries like Egypt, Yemen, and Morocco in particular. In general, poverty has been the single most factor in keeping young girls from school. In Egypt, the percentage of the population over 15 who are illiterate are 56% of women and almost half at 33% for men. While in Yemen, 75% of women over 15 are illiterate, while it is 33% for men. When faced with the need to make a choice, studies have shown that a large number of Arab families tend to favor a boy's education over a girl's. The same is true of higher education. Egypt's 2000 Demographic and Health Survey asked women with children ages 6 to 15, if parents have one son and one daughter, which child would you send to university? Although 53% of the women reasoned that their decision would depend on the child's individual capability, 39% picked the son to attend university, while only 8% said that the daughter should go. This is due in large part to patriarchal ideologies, but also because families choose to invest in a boy's education over a girl's, since a boy is thought to be able to take care of the family financially, while a girl's future labor is more beneficial to her husband's family. Young girls are therefore often denied opportunities for education, as their labor is needed to support their natal households, and then if they marry, their labor serves the marital household. Yet statistics show that this is changing in some countries. In Egypt, the ratio of girls to boys under the age of 15 who are educated is 96 girls to 103 boys. So this is actually happening today, at this time. Women constitute 21% of the labor force in Egypt today. Factory jobs in rural areas have been requiring basic literacy skills for employment, which has also provided the impetus for many rural families to educate their girls. While we're focused on women and labor, let us take a quick look at the relationship between education, labor, and the market. Approximately 25% of the Egyptian population is university educated, or they are in the process of obtaining university education. Yet at 9.4%, I imagine the rates are probably higher. The unemployment rates remain high, with 87.2% of the unemployed between the ages of 15 and 29. Now, this means that despite efforts to provide access for education in a country with high population levels like Egypt, almost its entire youth population remains jobless, a fact which has led to the January 25th revolution against the Mubarak regime. Another important factor that has significant ramification is that schooling does little to prepare students for 21st century jobs. The 2002 Arab Human Development Report sums it up as follows, quote, "In some countries, access to the secondary and higher education that helps create a skilled and knowledgeable labor force continues to be limited. Even where access is not a problem, the quality of the education provided is often low. The most worrying aspect of the crisis in education is education's inability to provide the requirements for the development of Arab societies," unquote. The report points to significant shortcomings in the educational systems in the Arab world, and particularly to the lack of student training in critical thinking and analysis. Moreover, the dually split system, with poor public education on one hand and elite private education on the other, has underscored wider and socioeconomic issues that cannot be ignored, such as the gap between the wealthy few and the poor majority. The widening of the gap between the underprivileged and the privileged is an observable phenomenon in every single country that has been part of the so-called Arab Spring. A key element in this unequal system that organizes access to resources, including education, among these countries is gender stratification. Women, as I have explained, remain largely marginalized, especially in rural areas, from gaining access to education, and patriarchal ideologies and rising levels of poverty place women's labor under the monopoly of others. According to a 2002 World Bank study, women had 22% of Egyptian households. A disturbing fact, considering that skills that women can draw upon for economic sustenance are limited by lack of access to education, and when possible, the education available to them does not adequately provide the necessary skills for 21st century employment. What makes women's situation particularly dire is that educational curricula remain mired in outdated gender ideologies that preclude women's equal participation in the labor market and political sphere in their country. So, having provided you with this very statistical introduction on the state of education in the Arab world with an emphasis on Egypt, I will now shift the discussion to examine the role played by Islamic organizations in the country, and particularly women's Islamic activism, in their efforts to overcome some of the challenges that make access to education difficult to the larger percentage of the population. So I will take as an example of these efforts the organization I call Al-Hilal, an Islamic PVO, private voluntary organization, run by activist women in Cairo. Just to give you another statistic, There are about 12,830 PVOs, or private voluntary organizations, as I mentioned, according to a 1990 report. And the numbers, we don't have actually the numbers right now, but we think that the numbers have more than quadrupled. But the important statistic here is that 74.5% of these PVOs are social development organizations dedicated to welfare, and most of them are Islamic PVOs. These PVOs operate under the auspices of MOSA, the Ministry of Social Affairs, but there are also larger and outreaching organizations that promote women's activism, and especially in the area of education, such as you might know, the Muslim Brotherhood. As a side note, the members of the MB is said to be around 50,000 to 60,000 registered members, with a further 400,000 to 500,000 sympathizers and supporters. Of the total number, 25 to 30% are women. For the most part, among the Muslim Brotherhood organizations, women continue to focus on religious education and charitable work. They coordinate their work and activities with the person in charge, almost always of the male cadre of women's activism, or Nashat and Nisa'i, in the administrative office for their respective areas. This form of Islamic women's activism, however, is male-sponsored, and it's very different from the organizations I worked in, which were entirely run and shaped by women's vision. So what I aim to show in this part of my talk is how Islamically informed educational reform has developed a wide social and intellectual base in the country. This is because these educational services are highly competent, free. I mean, they're given free of charge to whoever is interested, and they're also very available to the multitude of the underprivileged in Egypt. As I mentioned, the Ministry of Social Affairs regulates social activism in Egypt, although to some degree Islamic women activists exercise some freedom through private voluntary organizations. I've discussed this a little bit in my work because women are often, they get away with some things because they're not seen to be a threat. They're not, their work, their activism is not necessarily seen as political. They also present themselves in this apolitical kind of framework. So they get away with a lot, even though they're very closely monitored by the secret police, the so-called secret police. The scope of Islamic women's activism, however, extends beyond the walls of the center. So even though Al Hilal, for example, was housed in this 3-story building in a suburb of Cairo, most of the women who work in the center really rarely go to the center. They're always in rural areas or in poverty-stricken neighborhoods, trying to enable some of the goals of the institute, trying to help the poor, etc. I will talk a little bit about the project in Mehmet, the village I call Mehmet, in a few minutes. So I worked with the Gamaya, which I call Al Hilal, and Al Hilal is actually one of the largest network of women's Islamic PVOs. So by itself, it's an independent organization, but it belongs to this wider network of organizations in Cairo called Al-Zahra. And basically, these organizations network together. They create, common shows together. They create common bazaars together. They share a lot of revenue together. And these organizations also have transnational ties with similar Islamically run, organizations in Syria, Jordan, and also Lebanon. The activist women of Al Hilal crafted an Islamic agenda that speaks to divine ordinance, heavenly reward, and the principles and ethics of Islamic teaching. At their Islamic PVO, education and knowledge in particular were one of their greatest concerns. To them, government school curricula were both stagnant and inept, and this imbalance was redressed in their work. So basically, even though they focused on making Islam accessible to women, trying to explain to women what their obligations and rights in Islam are, they still focused on knowledge and education as the main, goal of the organization. Because to them, this was the key to reaching the population. This was the key to changing society in much better ways. And they saw that the failing of the government was really behind a lot of the ailments that people were suffering in the society. Now, modernization schemes in Egypt have often placed the education of the population at the center of their projects. Government schools today do not adequately meet the needs of the average Egyptian. Again, overpopulation, lack of resources, etc., make it very difficult for schools to actually meet the needs of its students. Now, the inadequacy of state-run schooling is therefore understood by most Egyptians as a failure of the government. This is like one of the most important markers of failure that the government has demonstrated to the population. The fact that they have been unable to sustain an educational system that allows social mobility and the improvement of life and the ability of people to struggle with poverty has been one of the main reasons why we see the revolution today, specifically in Egypt. So the activists in charge of the educational program of Al Hilal went to great lengths to develop curricula that complemented government curricula. And basically, I've seen these documents, they're like 150 pages long, that they reviewed every 6 months. So, the amount of effort and care and work these women put into their curricula was just incredible. And what they really did, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that they did, was that they focused on hands-on education. They wanted the children to feel that education was relevant to them, something that they don't actually have any access to in government-run schools because obviously, with lack of resources, how can you do hands-on? Hands-on involves a lot of resources, crafts, arts, etc. You take students out of the classroom, take them on trip, activities that student-run, government-run schools cannot afford or even dream about. So, another, important factor in some of the approaches that the women take in Al Hilal is, for example, that they take this holistic approach. So basically, young women or even older women in the community who are underprivileged, enroll in the center, for example, the center's activities. And they basically enroll because they want to improve their lives. They're either extremely poor, widowed, or taking care of a lot of children, and they really can't manage to go to a job, and then nobody takes care of their children, so they enroll. Their children go to the daycare center or after-school activities at the center while they go to work. In return for this service that the center is giving them, they also expect these women to enroll in literacy classes, in educational classes, to learn a vocation, to learn hygiene, etc. So there is this give and take between the community member and the organization itself. There has to be a commitment. And this commitment is recorded. So the women really fully expect, the activist women fully expect that these women from the neighborhood are committed to furthering the goals of the organization. So this approach, this holistic approach where vocational training is tied into, so when I say vocational training, I mean learning how to do a craft. Carpet weaving, for example, sewing, culinary skills, arts, etc. So those kind of, skills enable then the women in the neighborhood to go and find jobs. But that's not where it ends. In fact, if they excel in the PVO's program, they actually get a job at the PVO. They're employed by the PVO, or the PVO actually goes out and finds a job to them. Like I said, Al Hilal has a lot of relationships across the city, and so the members of the activist community is very, very active socially, and so they know how to put people and place them in jobs around the city. So to illustrate how this takes place, I will share with you this anecdote from my fieldwork in Mehmet, the village 20 miles down the Nile from Cairo. So this is a direct read from the book. Salwa, who is one of the activist Islamic women in the center, set up and ran a carpet weaving workshop in a one-story building a few meters from the center. So there's the center. Al Hilal is based in Cairo, okay, but then it has these satellite organizations in rural areas. So there's a center in the rural part of the city, and then outside of the city in Mehmet, the village that I call Mehmet. In anthropology, you're not supposed to mention the names of the villages or the actual names of the people, so you have to slightly change them. So the workshop, the carpet weaving workshop, is actually in the village, 20 miles away from the city. And I'll explain a little bit how she set this up. So what she essentially did was she hired this man who was a carpet weaver from Cairo, because of course carpet weavers don't live in these villages. The only people who live in the villages are essentially people who work on land, cultivating land. and people, government people, like people who are in charge of agricultural development, engineers who come and go, who are not really part of the community in many ways. So what you see here are these people who are, who live in very dire conditions, very high poverty levels. I mean, when I say very high poverty levels, it's enough to let you know that some of these people live on less than $2 a day. Of course, relatively speaking, things don't cost as much as they do in the US, but, people really struggle. And these villages are left to fend for themselves, literally. So basically, some of them don't even have running water. Some of the women that I've visited don't have running water. They don't have electricity. And so the organization of Al-Hilal has made it possible for the women of the village to actually have running water, to have hygienic bathrooms, to be able to, actually have a bathroom in the first place, to be able to have electricity in their homes, to put their children to schooling. I mean, all of this was made possible by the efforts of two women, just two women. Two women who are university educated, who came from the middle class and decided to do something about it. So they set up this incredible system, administered, more than 80 families in the village of Mehmet, and they were able to basically create networks and connections between this rural village that nobody knows about, right, and the city and the urban centers and administrative centers of the government. So they were really the go-between. They couldn't do this without the government, but at the same time, they were actually replacing the services of the government that were initially non-existent. So I walked in to the carpet weaving workshop, and the place really blew me away. It was so well organized. It was maybe half the size of this room, extremely clean. 6 different, weaving stations. Girls sitting behind the weaving stations. Very, they know exactly what to do. And the supervisor is showing them, helping some women here and going over there to help others. And there's this very collegial kind of atmosphere, and the women are very busy doing what they're doing. But the moment, this Salwa, the activist shows up, the girls just stop and they stare at her. And, you could almost see the worship in their eyes. I mean, the impression that I got from the reaction of these young girls working in the weaving center to Salwa, who comes essentially from an urban center, from Cairo. She doesn't really live in Mehmet. She commutes from there to the city. But just her mere presence amongst them gave them hope that they could actually be like her one of those days. I mean, this was, just by being there, by providing this role model for these girls in somewhere, in the middle of Egypt. She was already making a lot of changes there. So despite the similarity to the various weaving workshops that are set up for tourists in Saqqara, Kurdasa, and Akhmim, if you've been to Egypt, that carpet weaving is one of the most, popular tourist attractions. And basically, the tourist bus takes you to these workshops where you see, the workers sitting behind the weaving carpets, and they give you a drink. And anyway, so it's a big tourist trap. But the difference between these tourist, weaving centers and between the center that I saw in Mehmet is that the revenue of the center in Mehmet was going directly to the women who were working there and directly to the village. So they themselves were benefiting from their own labor. And I kind of wondered at the time, whether at some point these young women will take over those weaving centers and be able to run them themselves and expand on them. Salwa explained to me about, how she set this up, and, at the time when I saw this for the first time, they had 1 weaving center. Now they have 6 in the city. They're that popular. Now the weavers were also required to attend literacy classes and the weekly religious lessons. Donia, this 16-year-old girl, came up to Salwa. She was very embarrassed, and she said, I'm sorry, but my father has, will stop me from coming. I can't come anymore. And then here's where I see that, the difference between government-run schools and, the organization. Salwa just, is very calm and says, okay, I will speak to Hagga Samiha. Hagga Samiha is an older woman, Islamic activist in the center, who knows her father personally. And he will speak to your father. Don't worry, you're going to continue coming here. There's nothing to worry about. So there was always this personal element involved in the relationships. So as we, talked and inspected the carpets, we heard the call for midday prayer. The girls stopped and sat around Salwa in a big circle. Salwa began a short lesson in science. She brought out a few beautiful pictures of planets and stars that she had downloaded from the internet. And she said, see, the power of God is great. Not even the United States knows everything about outer space. The Americans have gone to the moon and sent rockets across the earth, but they still cannot measure the power of God. And then she launched on to the discussion of the planets and what are they called and the different planet systems. And, the girls were just mesmerized. At the end of the class, Salwa asked them to recite some verses from the Quran and then distributed their lunch. When they were finished eating, the girls went across the hall to perform their ablutions and came back quickly. As they got ready to begin praying, their eyes were riveted on Salwa. Finally, the small group stood shoulder to shoulder, with Salwa at the front leading them in prayer. Addressing the girls before the prayer, Salwa had emphasized the power of the Creator and the importance of following Him in their hearts and their daily lives. In her short lesson to the girls, she repeatedly stressed the importance of their commitment to development, education, and to being productive members of their community. She stressed hygiene and cleanliness, and indeed the girls kept the place immaculate, as I mentioned. In her exchange with the girls, Salwa emphasized achievement, the value of productivity and financial independence, and self-reliance. Her rhetoric captured a sense of the liberal modern as it is incorporated in Islamic discourse on ideal womanhood, which she herself exemplified to the girls and women of Mehmet. As I write, Salwa and Amina have carried out their Mehmet project now for maybe 7 years. The Mehmet project is a poignant example of the impact of Islamic activism in tackling poverty on the scale that I saw in this village. So other than these vocational training programs, Al-Hilal provides extracurricular support for school children, as I mentioned earlier, with classes that are specifically targeted to complement the government curriculum. And this is because they cannot really veer from the government curriculum because there are government exams, and without going through the government exams, the student cannot develop or go up, the classes in those schools. So basically the classes took place after school, during specific weekdays, on weekends, and during long vacations and summertime. Students also enroll in these programs free of charge, and the activists who teach these classes emphasize creativity and critical thinking in their curricula. Hands-on approaches, which encourage students' artistic skills, are a high point of these classes, and the children of the activists themselves actually often attend these classes as well. The third floor of Al-Hilal's building is where these classrooms are located. The hallways and doors are covered with bulletin boards that display students' work and art, very colorfully decorated with construction paper, cutouts that emphasize teaching concepts, and so on. So you never see those things actually in government schools. Another Islamic organization that I researched that was also run by women is called Al-Fath. This is a much smaller organization. It's run by an older generation of women, but they supported basically single-headed family households. And in those particular organizations, they helped support the children through school. They paid for their expenses, paid for their uniforms, clothing, their school supplies, etc. And on one occasion, I was invited to attend a celebration of about 75 children whose mothers were enrolled in Al-Fath's records. And this event really was such an eye-opening to the relationship that existed between this organization, between the children in the neighborhood, and how closely the women monitored their development and their growth, and how they established these very close relationships with their families and their mothers to see how well the children were doing in school and so on. So the girls and boys were invited to attend, could barely control their excitement. They were standing on the side of the room. The stage, was waiting for them. They were ready to go up. They were dressed in their, best clothes, their hair scrubbed, gleaming. And as each of their names was called, they came up, and shook the hand of the woman in charge of the organization. Then they received this nice certificate with their name on it. A small monetary sort of prize and a toy wrapped in colorful paper. And you can just see the incredible, delight on these children's faces. And you can imagine, the impact that such an occasion, just recognizing them for doing well at school, will have a long-term impact on their lives. The interesting thing was that one of the women of the center, her name is Suad, stood next to me. And basically kept nudging me and telling me every time somebody came up, she would say, "Oh, this is Sahar. Her mother was divorced and her husband left her to take care of 4 children. And then take note of Yasser. He is a cheeky one, but very smart. And this is Lamia. Look how cute she is. Barely out of the egg. It's an Egyptian expression. لسه خارجة ورا البيضة. She just came out. She just grew up, and she's already excelling at school." And on, she knew every child by name. She knew every child by name, knew all of their family history, who their mother was, what they did, etc., etc. And so it was just amazing how this woman kept track of the children that she's known for years and saw growing before her eyes. So anyway, so this was like another example of some of the events that these organizations did for the children. Now I want to, sort of shift the attention now to what's happening right now in the country. And you must have heard this, or maybe you haven't, and here you're hearing it for the first time, but recent elections, parliamentary elections in Egypt have revealed that Islamic organizations actually have swept the parliament. And basically the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party won about 47% of the seats in the lower house of parliament, and the Muslim Salafist Noor party won 25% of the elected seats. Now, it's being said that, well, this is because, basically the Muslims, the Muslim groups were, they hijacked the revolution, that they stepped into the shoes of the revolutionaries and they took over, the place that was supposed to be, the place for the revolutionaries, that the revolutionaries themselves should have been, at the top of the parliamentary elections. But of course, after, you have been introduced to the long history of Islamic organizing in Egypt and social welfare program and students being shaped, in Islamically oriented education, you can totally understand why a population that has 40% under the poverty line would elect Islamic groups, because they have been the most reliable, they have been there, they have replaced government services, and they don't know any alternative to any of these people. So basically, the Muslim Brotherhood really had a very easy win, although really it's not easy because they have been the only organized group that was not governmental in the country since the 1960s or 70s. So they've been organizing for many years. They've been, they existed before then, but this is the moment when they've really been engaged in social welfare and providing support and so on. So again, just to reiterate, the Muslim Brotherhood has about 20 to 30% of its members, has women as part of its members. They have also represented women in parliament. They're the most prominent group that has women on board in parliament. Now, the capacity in which they have women, of course, remains to be debated, because, women basically reinforce the gender ideology, the traditional patriarchal gender ideology, and so on. But even having these numbers of women, I think, for me, at least, is an improvement, because what's happening in parliament today is that the dearth of women's numbers in parliament is an alarming fact to many of us who are, observing these events. So, the recent event, therefore, did not emerge from within an Islamic framework. So when the revolution happened, people were always asking me, when I was giving talks, so is the Muslim Brotherhood behind this? Is the Muslim Brotherhood going to take over? I'm sure you were asked 100 times. And I would always say, no, the Muslim Brotherhood is not behind this. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood from the first day said that they would not take place in the protests, and they just kept away. And in fact, some of the interviews that I had with the protesters who were there, spending the night in Tahrir Square, basically told me that they were aided by the younger cadre of the Muslim Brotherhood, the younger men, the very young, the youth, who went there against their leaders' rules, and basically they just showed up because they were so, incredibly taken away by the revolution, and they wanted to help in any way they can. And in fact, their help was instrumental in the first few days of the revolution, because they helped organize, again, because they have this long history of organizing, social organizing. Their presence in Tahrir was instrumental. And then what happened afterwards is, as I mentioned, basically reaping what you sow. The Muslim Brotherhood has always been active, has tentacles everywhere in rural areas. They're very well known, very well established. Everybody knows who they are. And like I said, they're very reliable. And so they, their popularity basically presented them with parliament, handed them with parliament. The surprise, of course, is with the Salafis, but that's another story. So what I'm trying to say is that although observers of the revolt have credited the efforts of the government in promoting education in the last few decades for raising the consciousness of the population against the government, which is ironic, I also would like to add that it is Islamic women's activism that has been to a very large part behind some of the political changes and some of the political phenomena we've been witnessing, particularly in Egypt, is that Islamic women's activism in the area of education, whether it is with the Muslim Brotherhood or working independently as an organization such as Al-Hilal, that has made this big turning point in the political sphere in Egypt today. But then again, very few people mention these efforts, and of course it remains to be seen what's going to happen. But on a concluding note, which has nothing to do with education, is that the fact that secularly motivated groups and Islamic groups today share some common ground with regards to the principles they aspire to, namely democracy, social justice, dignity, the end of corruption, has the potential to begin a new future that is based on a critical intellectual exchange and not the abstract and anachronistic standoff that has long since characterized politics in the region as a secularist/Islamist binary or a modern/tradition debate. So thanks for listening.
I think that it would be lovely if I could provoke you to talk to one another a bit before we open up to the audience. And I wondered, Professor Ahmed, if in listening to Professor Hafez's comments about the role of education delivered through community organization, different kind of education than the model evoked by your presentation and your rich reading of those poems, in which the ostensible meaning you reveal to be, in fact, quite different from the contextualized meaning, the vision of multiculturalism that we think of unfolding in a different way. In any event, as you hear Professor Hafez's remarks about education in Egypt today, what question you would put to her?
You're quite right. It's a very different model of education, and yet, of course, it is rooted in the secular Western model of the critical thinking that I was talking about. So, but I did find it actually. There were moments as I listened when I thought, well, my goodness, we need to just duplicate this across the Muslim world, and then we'd have we'd have an educated. How did these women do it? It seems fantastic. It seems. How do they raise the money for this? Who pays for this?
Individual efforts. Believe it or not, I've been studying this phenomenon now for 10 years. I'm that enthralled. My first book, The Terms of Empowerment, I was looking at women's empowerment in general. And then I was introduced to the work of this woman called Leila Ahmed.
Yes, I want to ask you about
that. Work, for example.
Yes, well, I know she's at the moment at Georgetown, is that right?
Is she at Georgetown? I thought she was at AOC.
Yeah, she is at agency, but she's this year she's spending a year in Georgetown.
Fantastic.
So
she was in Oxford, of course, I know her personally.
She's very impressive, is she?
She's very impressive, and she's actually, for those of you who don't know, she's just one of the Leila Ahmed is contemporary of mine, actually, and she's a professor of political science. And I met Hiba when I was working on women's activism in Cairo. And someone mentioned her name to me and said, you really have to meet this woman. I can't even remember how we got to meet. I think I called her up on the phone and introduced myself. And she said, oh yeah, come over to my house, And I remember I was working at Said Joseph, was actually my supervising professor during that time. And after the meeting, I called Saad on the phone and I said, really disturbed by this meeting. And she said, well, why are you disturbed? At the time, I was really under the illusion that feminism has to take particular parameters in order to be actually feminism, and I was really sort of under that impression. And when I met Hiba Raouf, who's an Islamist scholar, and an Islamist member of, I think she was in the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, or her husband was in the Muslim Brotherhood, I realized that this is not really applied to my idea of what it's like to be a Muslim activist. This was a long time ago, I have to admit. And so I said, just go with it. If you're uncomfortable, it means you're learning something. just go with it. And later on, when I met Hiba again, we had more conversations, and I realized that I really had to reevaluate the way I was thinking about Muslim feminism. which is a term really that many of these women reject, and they don't want to identify with Western feminism. But then to go back to your question, I digress. How do these women start? Two of the women, the Dr. Shadia, who is the head of the organization, is a dentist. And right now I think she's nearing maybe 70. And one of her partners, Dr. Hafez, another woman who was actually given in her country and came back to Egypt and had a lot of time on her hands, didn't know what to do. The two of them got together and they decided to create, a learning community. Like they would start reading the Quran and they would start teaching themselves about Islam. And this is how it started. It started in one of their homes. They started, reading through the tafsir, the interpretation of the Quran. They started teaching themselves fiqh, and then, the dentist.
Can we believe that the proliferation of these all over the country, or are they unusual? Is the country being transformed, in fact, by such women?
I think it's being transformed in a very subtle way.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that it's not very visible. The example I can give you, for example, among all of my friends and classmates, I think myself and two other people are the only ones who are not there and not Islam. And these are Western educated.
But what does that mean? I don't understand.
That means that Islamization and women's organizing has become so widely spread that it's actually part and parcel of the Egyptian fabric of the society.
Well, no, one can see that by simply looking at the pictures of photographs of Egyptian women now. Most of them are in hijab.
Exactly. Or they are, isolated in pockets. So yes, I mean it is very widely spread. And it is not unlike what many Western spectators or thinkers think. It is not this sort of oppressive.
Well, I mean, one has to recall. I don't know how many people here saw, but when the Egyptian Revolution was going anyway, some of the video that set it going, that went viral, was by Asma Mahfouz, a woman in a hijab who was calling out for human rights. So.
Right. Human rights and obligating men, men's masculinity. Saying, if you're a man, show up and protect me. And then evoking religion at the very end of her talk, It's a very inspiring speech. If you haven't seen it, you should look up Asma Mahfouz's
video,
YouTube
video.
Could you spell that?
Asma is ASMAA. Yeah, and then Mahfouz is MAHFOUZ.
Professor Hafez, you have acknowledged the importance of Professor Ahmed as an exemplar and an inspiration. Do you have a question that you'd like to put to her?
I have a lot of questions for her, really. There's not enough time, unfortunately.
Well, start with one.
Well, I know exactly why she read those two pieces, and I know exactly why she was interested in this kind of education. And could you explain, perhaps to the audience who don't know, why you yourself were inspired by this form of education?
Which
personally? Personally, multiculturalism. I mean, when we talk about personal subjectivity, how we are constituted as subjects in a post-colonialist world, do you think of yourself as a post-colonial subject?
Yes, but I don't use these words. I don't talk about my post-colonial subjectivity. I have to translate to speak. Okay. I mean, I am, whether I like it or not, I went to a British school in Egypt.
Right.
I was raised by a Christian as well as a Muslim.
Right.
I grew up in a multi-religious. I mean, when I hate people talk about America being multi-religious, forgive me for being seemingly ethnocentric, but I mean, for goodness sake, we grew up with these as fundamental, the idea of respect for other religions. But what you hear about the Muslim world or about Egypt that's not true. But it was in my day, so something has been lost, is being lost. Like our Jewish populations, that was a huge loss. The Christian populations are decreasing, that's a tragic loss too. So there's no way that I cannot be,
Right.
but I have no idea. But another way of looking at it is actually, I think what's happened to me is on the way to happening probably to everyone, including people in this room. You know, it may seem more dramatic when I'm speaking a language other than the country of my born, but many of my own students are doing huge migrations, even from one part of America to another. Generationally they're migrating, they're multicultural, they're exposed to things that are, so it's one way or another, this is the route we're all going to travel, the future in particular.
This is actually one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Islam of Our Own, because I wanted to show the reader that just because we call these women Muslim, or just because they are veiled, doesn't necessarily mean that their subjectivities or their personhood, to use a more usable word, were entirely shaped in an Islamic bubble. And
what you said sounded very secular Western to me, actually. It's embedded in secular. I mean,
but not multicultural in the way that you described Egyptian society.
Not in the way I described it. That's right. That has to be found again.
I wouldn't say that it's not as multicultural. I think that we as people are shaped, and even the women that I worked with in these organizations, many of the things that they said in an Islamic spirit. Right? They told me, okay, so we're going to tell you. So I asked them, for example, one of the first questions I would ask is, what is deen? What is religion? And many of them would describe religion in very secular terms. And this really blew me away. I mean, I expected them to be ready with an answer, to be, there's this very kind of mantra that they would repeat over. But every single one, stumbled, started thinking, were shocked at the fact that they've internalized the whole time their assumptions about religion.
Yeah.
And then they started describing it as, this relationship, private relationship with God, all of these things that, are supposed to be secular, right? I mean, the whole idea of secularism is that not to deny the existence of religion, but to relegate religion to the private sphere, which of course it never is relegated to the private sphere. But among these women, they really define their religion as many of them.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you're saying, I mean, as I said, you're making my point that actually for all this apparent, this visible religiousness, it's profoundly secular. And the Islam of today is not the Islam of 50 years ago, which was very private, very non-visible, completely different. But this one is very, I mean, talking about post-colonial or it's totally permeated by Western secularism, this kind of new kind of Islam.
Absolutely, because after all, at the end of the day, with the modernization schemes that, this is your work. I mean, the history and how you've defined it for all of us. The history of the education and how it emerged from British institutions and how it became part of the modernization schemes of nation building. I mean, all of this is part and parcel of what constitutes the citizen of the state today. So it's not like these people were raised in the desert, tending goats and worshiping, God every day. I mean, that's not what happened. These people were part of the state, civil state, and they essentially were constituted by education that was put in place by a modernizing government. After the 1952 revolution in Egypt, Egypt basically oriented itself to the West, and a lot of the ideas of Western education, a lot of the ideas of colonialism, found their way in the educational system. I myself went to a school that used to be a British school, just like you.
Right, so you totally, what was you used to accept, you were just as mixed up as I am, are you?
Well, I think that it would be a mistake to think of ourselves as being, essential beings, as being homogenous and non-diverse. I think that would be a shame, don't you think?
Absolutely, I completely agree with you.
Do you have questions for our speakers?
I have a question that kind of came out of your last exchange. What does it mean for the future of education internationally that American institutions are on some level bringing their educational model abroad? It's no longer through a colonial institution yet, or a colonial construct, it's more American private institutions are, and even some state universities are creating educational institutions in the Gulf region, in China. what does that mean for the future of the educational systems in those countries?
Well, you know, I have to say that I am actually, well, I feel enormously personally grateful to the education I got. Even if it's been in the hands of me, I don't regret at all that I grew up singing hymns, that's fine. I'm happy to have as rich varieties and possibilities in my life. So I think there's something in me that would like to say I'm against Western domination, and I am against Western domination. But I also do tend to think that the critical thinking is something I value tremendously, and I think that is something that young people should. I mean, I can't see that it damages young people. I think it's a gift to have it. Am I wrong?
No, I certainly agree with you. And I think if you were watching the events during the revolution, all of the young people were so fluent in English.
Yeah.
And they were, easily understood by a Western audience. And they could have a conversation with a Western audience. In fact, this whole Facebook sort of, the label of the revolution as a Facebook revolution. Facebook was a revolution in itself.
Right.
And the connections that, it created between, a lot of the Egyptian youth and international youth and international movements, I think was behind a lot of the enriching dialogues that took place.
I don't want to lose sight of, I actually do think we have to think carefully. I don't quite know how, but I do think there is loss too. And there are many oral cultures that are extraordinary, that have enormous riches, just as much riches as written cultures. How do we honor these and make these part of the larger package? I think that has to be something we think about. If I think of my own history, many of my female relatives, older relatives, women, were profoundly wise people, actually. But they were not at all part of the Western way of thinking. And it's a huge loss to me. I think I've internalized some of the things, but I don't know how to speak about them really, because it's not exactly a verbally articulate culture the way Western culture is, but it's invaluable. I think that's probably true of many women's cultures in this sense, or non-dominant white cultures. So I think we do have to think about it. It's not all just a wonderful story. It is a one. We have to keep all the wonderful things. I don't know how we do it, but we need to do it.
It's interesting that you mentioned the older women in your life and how wise. I think about that a lot.
Yes.
I grew in a family with a lot of older, strong, very wise women. And the conversations with them are invaluable to me right now. So I agree with you that there's a lot that needs to be preserved. And I think there is a lot of effort that's being now invested in keeping, a lot of the traditions alive, and keeping, it's a reinvented tradition. And there are losses. I totally agree with you, but I think that that's part and parcel of social change. There have to be losses, although like you said, there has to be a balance between the losses and the gains and what gains.
I'm not convinced that we've figured out exactly how to do this, how to not to lose more. We're losing more than we should, I think. But I don't know how to do it.
Well, we should continue to work.
We should.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the model used for the carpet weaving, and I'm also really interested in how they've managed to keep the funds generated from going mainstream and using that, and then thirdly, how they've been successful in having 6 more that you mentioned of these. I think you went from 1 carpet weaving and they've now expanded to 6, I think.
Yes. Okay, so the first part of your question has to do with the model that was used. So basically, they're using, the women in Helena are using an integrated model. So it's not like they're saying, okay, so now we have Arabic, and then we're going to have religion, and then we're going to have carpet weaving. I mean, there is a scheme that they're following, but everything is integrated. So it's more of a holistic kind of approach than, a subject-specific approach. And the relevance of learning, the hands-on, the relevance of learning the things that they learn is the main vision that drives the entire scheme. So the students, whether they are older women or younger children, understand immediately why they're learning this stuff. Nothing is abstract. Nothing is, out there. It's all in here, you're going to use it, this is how you would improve, this is how you would change society. Their vision is always there at their fingertips, always reiterated through the activities that they do. So, when I describe that particular scene, I would say that they were teaching science, they were teaching, the weaving hands-on activities, they were teaching Islamic teachings, and at the same time they were also investing in this, vision of the center, making sure that the students understood what the vision for social change was. So that's the model. And then you were talking about the funding.
Right, how they managed to keep it, sort of internally rather than lose it to mainstream marketing.
Well, there's a lot of money in Egypt. A lot of people think that, Egypt is just destitute. That's not true. I mean, there are, the elite, the people who are, basically, who have the greatest access to resources have a lot of money. And basically these women have connections and raise funds. I remember in Ramadan, the month of fasting, I was actually having tea with one of the women, and I literally could not talk to her because her phone kept ringing every 2 minutes with people wanting to give donations. Just people that she knew, who knew other people, who knew other people. And then, of course, the production. I mean, a lot of the products that they create, that the women create, are sold. And then that's how they increased the size of the weaving project. Their carpets were beautiful. And they sold very well in very large numbers because the prices are much lower than the prices on the market. So people go to the bazaars, they pick up these things, and then more production is being put forth, and then, the revenue is used to expand and also to pay for the workers, the women who work on the weaving. So it's a sustainable development. That's how sustainable development should be like.
You both, I would say, for different reasons, give a hope to me at least in your presentations. Thank you very much.